Before I introduce Josh Freeman and turn the program over to him, I want to share with you and also acknowledge all the folks who have been working on this program and plug our upcoming public program that's happening next week. Our mission at SLU is to expand worker opportunity, develop the next generation of labor and community leaders, and meet the educational needs of the labor movement and our broader community. SLU is one of the newest colleges in the City University of New York system, but we grew out of worker education and community organizing programs that have deep roots and a long history in the city. Today, SLU offers undergraduate and master programs in labor and urban studies, as well as certificate programs in areas as labor relations and community organizing. If this sounds like something that you want to be part of, we'd love to hear from you. We're currently accepting applications for the spring semester, and there's several scholarships available. You can visit the website for more info, or you can talk to any of our staff that's here tonight. There's also a lot of current SLU students in the house if you have questions for them as well. I want to thank all of the staff at CUNY SLU who have worked on making this program possible, especially all the behind-the-scenes work. A big thank you to the public engagement team, Michael, Nadia, Rose, and Chris, Maureen, Manager of Institutional and Academic Partnerships at SLU, the Communications Department, especially Aaron, who is single-handedly running all of our AV tonight, the Facilities team, especially Keisha, Matthews, and Marta, our IT department, especially Kelvin and Tariq, and our colleagues who have stayed late to help with the event. Tonight's program is our second to last before the end of the semester, and next Tuesday morning, December 16th at 9:30 a.m., I hope you can join us in person for our labor breakfast conversation with Sultana Hussain, Recording Secretary of the Amazon Labor Union, IBT Local 1. There's flyers for the event on the check-in table. A note about tonight's program. At the close of the panel discussion, we will have audience questions. You'll be able to share questions live from the roving mics or by writing them down on the half sheets of paper available at the check-in desk. They'll also be passed out by staff as we get closer to this portion of the evening. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, but first round priority will go to SLU students and to transit workers. If submitting written questions, please note if one of these applies to you. And we also ask that folks keep their questions to about a minute, and that in the space of learning, we enter into debate with mutual respect. I'm thrilled to welcome Joshua P. Freeman. Freeman is a distinguished professor of history emeritus at Queens College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York. He has written extensively about the history of labor, modern America, and New York City. His books include Working Class New York, Life and Labor Since World War II, In Transit, The Transport Workers Union in New York City, 1933 to 1966, and most recently, Garden Apartments, The History of Low-Rent Utopia. He consults for unions and for the New York City Central Labor Council on strategy and internal education. Please join me in welcoming Josh.
Thank you, Sarah. 20 years ago this month, as we all know, New York City transit workers walked off their job, shutting down the transit system for 3 days. It was a monumental event in the history of the city. So I'm really delighted that you're all here. We're joining together to examine this historic strike, to hear about how it unfolded, its effects, maybe a little bit even about its lessons it might have for today. I have to say I'm especially pleased that there are a number of veterans of that strike who are with us. Sitting right in front of me is Ed Watt, who was Secretary Treasurer during the strike. I'm thinking if I get something wrong, Ed's going to be correcting me, as he should. And also, please excuse my voice. I'm just getting over a cold. It's especially an honor to have with us Roger Toussaint, who, and I think you all know, as president of Local 100, he led the strike in 2025. So it's great to have Roger here. Kafui Atto, who is here at the School of Labor and Urban Studies, will join with me after Roger's presentation. We'll have a discussion among the three of us, and then, as Sarah mentioned, we'll throw things open for questions from the audience, some of which we've already received, and others we'll get through the mic. I'm going to more fully introduce Roger and Kafui in a couple of minutes, but I want to provide a little bit of a historical context to think about the 2005 strike. I'm a historian, that's what we do. Over the past 6 decades, 60 years, transit workers have really been exceptional among New York public sector workers in their willingness to go on strike for better pay and benefits, to defend things that they had won in the past, to make sure those would be available for other workers in the future. They had a kind of militancy which is not typical of most public employees in our city. And in their actions, they help shape labor relations, not just for themselves, but really for the whole city, at least certainly for the whole public sector. And I think you get some sense of how this unfolded if you look at the 3 different strikes that transit workers engaged in over those past 60 years. So that's what I'm very briefly going to discuss. The first strike was in 1966, and when that occurred, when transit workers walked off their job and paralyzed New York City for 12 days, city workers in many cases were not yet unionized, and they were generally paid really abysmally. Public sector strikes were illegal in New York, and they were very rare. And for many years, the TWU had used or tried to use political influence, backroom deals to improve benefits and pay, but really with only modest success. And workers were, frankly, pretty fed up. And Mike Quill, who was the president of the union, knew it. So in 1965, when a new mayor was elected, John Lindsay, who came into office saying he wanted to weaken the power of unions, and he had the backing of the city establishment behind him, Quill decided to throw caution to the wind and called the first general transit strike in New York City since 1916. It had been 50 years since transit workers across the city had stopped work. And it ended in a tremendous victory. The strike ended with a 2-year contract with a 15% wage increase. And you know, it's worth stopping for a moment to think about that number. You know, in 1966, the inflation rate was 3%, which is just about what it is now. And workers got 7.5% a year. And I think any public employee in New York who could get 4.5% a year above inflation today would fall on their knees in gratitude. And that was just the beginning. That strike opened the door for other advances by TWU in future bargaining rounds. I have to say, on a personal note, the 1966 transit strike was the first time I really saw the power of workers when they acted together. I was a high school student in Queens, and I got to see the world turned upside down. You know, the mayor got on the radio and told the citizens of New York, don't go to work. You know, and then I went down to Northern Boulevard near my house, and there were these businessmen in suits and overcoats and briefcases hitchhiking to go to their offices in Manhattan and getting nowhere because, you know, everything was just congealed in a traffic jam. And, you know, I was 16 and had no responsibility. It was a gas, you know, to see what people could do if they acted together at the time. That strike destroyed the Condon-Wadlin Act. That was a law passed in 1947 that outlawed strikes in New York State and had severe penalties. Part of the deal that ended that strike was there was going to be amnesty for the strikers. So the governor, Nelson Rockefeller, appointed a commission to come up with a new law. The head of the commission was a guy named George Taylor, and the law they came up with, I think we all have heard of it, it's the Taylor Act, right? And the Taylor Act, on one hand, for the first time, said public employees in the state of New York had the legal right to join a union, okay? But it also continued the illegality of public sector strikes, now with penalties that were a little bit more modest, with the idea that they wouldn't be so severe that you couldn't use them. So this would now be a real effective anti-strike measure. In the beginning, it didn't work. Despite that strike, there was a following 1966 transit walkout, there was a wave of public employee strikes. Teachers went on strike in 1966, 7, and 68. Sanitation men in 1969. Bridge tenders and sewage treatment plant workers in 1971. These workers had seen from the 66 transit strike that militancy paid off and that strikes could be won. And the result of all this union action was nearly a decade of dramatic improvements in pay, benefits, and working conditions for city workers. And what did this actually mean? It meant that families that had been barely scraping by, families of public employees, now could think about buying a car, buying a house, sending a kid to college, taking a vacation, retiring when you still had a couple of years left in which to enjoy that. So there's a tremendous upward trajectory of worker standard of living and union power until the mid-'70s. And then it came to an end with the New York City fiscal crisis, because that set off a kind of counter-revolution, if you want to think of it that way, by business against the power of workers, trying to diminish the benefits that the city gave to its residents and reduce the benefits that city workers received. So collective bargaining, which used to be for winning new raises, now became the occasion for givebacks, for deferring wages you had already agreed to, for reducing benefits, for speeding up. And most unions were either unwilling or unable to fight this new kind of austerity regime they had taken over. And this is the circumstances that led to the next transit strike in 1980. Multiple opposition groups within TWU won offices, particularly executive board seats, because workers, transit workers, felt that their union leaders were not effectively fighting to win decent contracts and to push back against management, which was increasingly aggressive and punitive in a transit system that was literally falling apart. I think there are a few people here who could testify that because of the lack of investment. So just before the TWU contract was set to expire in 1980, when the TWU president at the time, John Law, went to the executive board with what he said was the MTA's final offer. And then he said, well, I've got a counteroffer. And this had all been orchestrated with the MTA head, Richard Ravage. It was just an orchestration. To everyone's surprise, the union executive board rejected both the offer and the counteroffer, and a strike began. And the strike ended up lasting for 11 days. And it was really a bitter battle. Even compared to 1966, the mayor, Ed Koch, and the business community were viciously anti-union. But the workers stayed out for 11 days. They won a contract that was considerably better than what had been offered before they went out. But the strike ended in disarray. When that new offer was put before the executive board split. It was a tie vote. And not clearly legally, the president of the union, John Law, simply declared the strike over then and there, and that was it. And under the Taylor law now, the strikers in 1980 had to pay 2 days pay fine for every day they were on strike. And that wiped out the whole first-year gain under the new contract. So in part because I think of that reason, many transit workers did not think the strike was a success. And instead of sparking a wave of militancy by other workers, as it happened in 1966, the 1980 strike was followed by a quarter century without a single major public employee strike here in New York City. Well, during these years, a new generation of activists began organizing inside the TWU, among them Roger Toussaint and a number of other people who are with us today. And theirs is a remarkable story of how they built a movement that in 2000 took over the leadership of Local 100. Once in power, with an ambitious bargaining program. The new group that had come to lead the union confronted a recalcitrant management. It almost resulted in a strike in 2002, and then in 2005, there were extremely tense and difficult negotiations, which, as we all know, ended with a walkout. And when transit workers walked out in 2025, they were doing what had become almost unthinkable. You know, it had been so long since there had been a significant walkout like this that the idea of defying the law to exert your power by staying home had sort of disappeared, I think, from the way people thought about possibilities. So it was really quite something. I'm not going to go into the specifics of the reasons for the strike. I think we'll hear from them in a minute. But I think, in my view anyway, the strike was largely defensive against an effort by MTA to diminish benefits for future workers and weaken the union. We'll also hear about the conduct and the outcome of the strike, to what extent it was a success and what limitations were. But however you see those issues, I do want to make one point. There's no question that this strike electrified the city, or at least part of the city, you know. Despite the inconveniences it caused, and, you know, this was 20 years ago, it was cold. You know, it was cold 20 years ago in December. And you couldn't get where you had to go, you know. In spite of the inconveniences that the public suffered, there was strong support for the strike. And the effort by Mayor Michael Bloomberg to rally the public against the strikers, as Mayor Koch had done in 1980, fell on its face. It just fell on its face. After the strike ended, I thought it would be the beginning of a revitalization of public sector unionism in New York. Not for the first time, I turned out to be wrong. That has not been the case. As after the 1980 strike, the 2005 strike was followed by many years of union quiescence. Since 2005, municipal unions have rarely mobilized their members and generally have accepted contracts that have, you know, barely kept up with inflation and preserved existing benefits. The idea that unions are supposed to make things better, you know, has almost disappeared from our collective bargaining universe in the New York public sector. So in retrospect, to me, 2005 looks like a kind of aberrant moment, an exceptional moment in the broad pattern of labor and class relations. Well, to discuss all this, we have with us the key actor, or a key actor in the strike, Roger Toussaint. A lot of you know Roger, but for those of you who don't, Roger came to New York from Trinidad in 1974. He'd been expelled from his high school for political activity. He shaped up and got himself a degree at Brooklyn College when he got to New York, and then took a job in transit, first as a cleaner, and then as a track worker in 1985. He became active in organizing his fellow workers, and in 1994, he was elected to head the track division of Local 100. In 1997, he joined forces with New Directions, which was a large opposition caucus, and in 2000, New Directions succeeded in the union elections, with Roger becoming the president of Local 100. And it was the culmination, and again, it's really a remarkable story, of a 15-year effort by workers to reinvent their union. Roger served in jail for 3 days for his role in the strike, and he continued to lead Local 100 as its president until 2009, when he took a position with the TWU International, and then retired in 2012. Also joining us is Kafri Atto, Associate Professor of Urban Studies here at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. He's also affiliated at the Graduate Center in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. Kafri is a geographer by training, and he's written extensively about urban transportation, public space, and democratic access to the city, particularly in two books. His first, Rights in Transit, Public Transportation and the Right to the City in California's East Bay, and more recently as co-author of Disrupting DC, The Rise of Uber and the Fall of the City. So it's with great pleasure that I again welcome everybody and turn things over to Roger.
Thank you, Josh. And I'd like to thank CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies for hosting this event. Thank Josh, thank Professor Kafu. I'd like to thank Michael and Sarah for all of the work that you all have been doing. And Maureen as well has been helping out a great deal. And special welcome to all CUNY students, fellow transit workers, and other strike leaders who I see in the room here today. You may get an opportunity to recognize some folks at the end, but you have a lot of resources here to answer questions that may come up because a number of principals are in the room who led key aspects of this struggle. What you saw when you were before the meeting was a photo journey through the strike. We put up about 100 photos. We have another album that we would refer you to at the end with over 1,200 photos from the strike. And those photos are from immediately before, during, and after the strike. It shows literally thousands of transit workers participating in the strike. It shows demonstrations on the shop floor, demonstrations through neighborhoods and communities adjoining our transit properties. It shows school children visiting the strike lines. And it makes the point, I think, that this was really a community event. The strike was a community event, which we are very proud of. So I'd like to begin by providing a somewhat of aerial view of what was going on at the time. It is impossible to understand the strike in 2005 without understanding the 20 years that had come before it. 20 years involved Reagan and Reaganomics in the 80s, followed by the Clintons, followed by Bush in the White House. The Clinton years was no departure from the negative stuff that was taking place under Reagan. What Clinton did is put a more liberal, disarming twist to Reagan's policies. So Reagan, Clinton, and Bush meant repeated setbacks, givebacks, and sometimes crushing and punishing treatment for working people in the US. And this was in the 20 or so years preceding the strike. So looked at from the standpoint of resistance before our strike, I think most notably, we have to mention the PATCO strike in 1981. That's the Air Traffic Controllers Organization. They had endorsed Reagan in the 1980 elections and believed that they had a friend in the White House. They went on strike. Reagan fired all 11,000 of them. And this was followed by over 2 decades of concessionary bargaining from coast to coast, of losses for the average worker, and unions kneeling before the governments, the municipalities, and the powers that be, both private sector and public sector. Of course, Reaganomics meant widespread deregulation. And then we had, of course, the World Trade Center, followed by the passage of the Patriot Act with massive domestic surveillance, and the authorization for war in Iraq came in October of 2002, followed by an invasion in March of 2003. And so this was a period not only of material losses, but also of erosion of the will of the population to fight back and of the fighting capacity. So we were dealing with a generation that was angry and bitter but unaccustomed to defiance and mass resistance. So during this time, there were some notable crossroads that were encountered in the attempts to put up resistance to this trend. The Hormel meat packers strike should be mentioned. This was 1985. It was a brutal 10-month strike in Austin, Minnesota. They brought out the National Guard against those strikers. And the community, they were relatively isolated from the community, and the strike was basically crushed. Of the 1,500 meat packers involved, about 1,000 were fired or did not return back to work. And instead, they utilized or hired immigrant labor to replace them. This was followed in 1997 by the UPS workers' strike, 185,000 UPS members striking over the conversion of their jobs to part-time jobs. That strike was largely successful in securing the pensions, wage increases, and so forth. But that was 1997. Beyond that, the resistance was scattered and not attaining national significance. There was a lull, and then there was the New York City transit strike, which I believe is rich in its history and lessons, and is why we're here today to mark it 20 years later. So in looking backward, I think is also useful before we return to the strike to look forward, to see what happened after the strike. So there were other crossroads, other junctions that we encountered after the strike that we could, in hindsight, point to. The Arab Spring in 2010, the Wisconsin Public Sector Workers Uprising in 2011, Occupy Wall Street in the same year, the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013, that begins in 2013, all the way up to the mass protests against genocide in Gaza and the No Kings protests today. Despite the lulls and the twists and turns, the direction was clear. People are looking for ways to resist and fight back. Our 2005 strike falls smack in the middle of that continuum, of that period, between Reagan to Donald Trump. And it is marked by resistance, attempts at resistance all the way. And the feature of this resistance is that the only time you make a breakthrough, or you come close to making a breakthrough, is when you're prepared to come hard or go home. Now, so this brings us quickly to the strike. So I want to address it from 4 different points of view. One is, how did we get there? How did we pull it off? How did we survive it? And how it lives on. So, leading into our strike, the situation in the public sector is that there were long expired contracts, sometimes for 1 term, 2 terms. There was no respect for deadlines and expirations. Meanwhile, there was galloping inflation and widespread frustration among public sector workers. There was also tremendous anger directed at unions and other established leaders for their failures to respond properly to this situation. And then enters TW. Now, TW enters this situation under the slogan, no contract, no work, a deadline is a deadline. And let me pause for a second on that issue. At the time of our strike, TW was probably the only remaining public sector union that maintained the position that our deadline meant something. That when the contract expired, things are going to happen. that you could not ignore us like how you ignored all the other public sector unions and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years without a contract. And this is something that I think that the MTA was tone deaf to, and they paid a price for it, and the city was to have to reckon with that action on the part of the MTA. Inside of the MTA, what was going on? Widespread abuse. Workers were angry and frustrated at the MTA. They were angry at what we refer to as, in the MTA, commonly as plantation justice. They handle disciplining workers as like a plantation situation. If there's a problem, you take out the whip and you apply the whip until the problem goes away. As an example of the reign of terror going on, at the time of the strike, the MTA was experiencing about 16,000 disciplinary actions annually against transit workers. Disciplinary actions for all sorts of arbitrary minor stuff, mostly time and attendance violations. If you're out sick and you leave your home and you didn't call in before you left your home, or you called in and said you were going to the grocery or to the pharmacy, and then you changed location and stopped off by your parent to drop off groceries or medicine, you would be charged for violations all along the way, for leaving home without calling, for changing location without calling, for every single thing. And this was the nature of life for transit workers under the MTA. I'll give you one example which is my own case. At the time that I was elected president of the union, I had been fired from transit for 2.5 years. Had gone 2.5 years without a paycheck. And I was fired as a union chairman, a division chairman, because I was in a vehicle as a passenger and the vehicle had a car accident. We were moving from a meeting with one manager to a meeting with another manager. The car was driven by a staff rep, stopped at a street light on Atlantic Avenue, rear-ended by an elderly person, and the transit authority brought a charge that I should have been in a transit authority vehicle, not in a union vehicle. And the penalty they sought was dismissal. And then they implemented the penalty because the union that had my paperwork submitted the appeal 1 day late. And therefore the penalty was implemented with no hearing, and that was it. And I was a union chairman at the time. But that's just an example of the extent to which, or how arbitrary discipline at the MTA had become. Now, it also should be, you should take note of the fact that when transit workers elect someone to be president to lead them, who has no job, who has been fired, that says something about the mindset of transit workers. And if they were listening, if they had an ounce of sense, they would have said, wait a minute. But they didn't, right? That's the extent to which they were tone deaf. So that was the situation in terms of the mindset of transit workers in the period leading up to the decision to go on strike. But the MTA added more to it. The day before our contract was due to expire, the MTA had a meeting, the board met and made a decision to dispose of a $1 billion surplus. So they divvied up the $1 billion surplus without assigning a penny to the transit contract that was about to expire within hours. So unsurprisingly, transit, the members in New York City Transit, when we polled them before we went out, 65% of them were in favor of a strike. And when we did go out on strike, 73% of transit workers, that number went up to 73%. So part of the reason for this is, and what the reason for why we ended up on strike is because the MTA did not believe that we would go out on strike. And that's not unreasonable. It's not without reason. There had been no strike in the previous 8 or 9 rounds of bargaining. and not in 2002 when we came close to the wire, but did not go out. So as a result, the MTA thought that we will be talking and bluffing and we would not go out on strike. In 2002, we preserved our health benefits, which was under threat, and converted our health benefits from a defined contribution-based plan to a defined benefit, a guaranteed benefit. And were it not for that, we would have probably gone out on strike in 2002 because they were threatening to cut our medical benefits. And we had made it clear to them that that would be a strike issue, that we would have no choice but to go out on strike if you attempt to reduce our members' medical benefits. But the MTA did not believe we would go out on strike in 2005. This time in 2005, our pension was on the line, or more precisely, the pension for new hires. So, had they been paying attention to what was going on on the properties and in the union, they would have smartened up and have recognized that there was a train coming at them, so to speak, in transit speak. Because we had begun preparations for what we knew was going to be eventually a massive confrontation from day one. From the time I took over the leadership of the union, and from the time the New Directions caucus won the elections in 2000, and change began in 2001. We began a series of measures immediately. For instance, we began to take measures to better connect the leaders with the membership, to address the alienation of the union leaders from the union members. A number of things we did to get our house in order. We used the momentum of leadership change to do a crash course in culture change. It was very challenging. The following reforms are some among the things that we did. We cut officers and staff salaries, beginning with a 25% cut in my own salary and an 8% cut in all other officers and staff salary, reduction in all of other officers and staff salary. We converted the sick benefits, the health benefits, and the pension benefits of union staffers to roughly resemble the benefits of transit workers. So for instance, at the time that I took over, if you're a union officer or union staffer, you were entitled to unlimited paid sick time. In some instances, you had officers who were out for 2 years and they were receiving their full paychecks. But transit workers only received 12 sick days. So we changed it to convert union officers' sick time to 12 sick days per year. And we did the same thing with respect to their pensions. We eliminated the staff pension plan, which was we call it a Cadillac plan. Like, as president, I was signing checks for people, lump sum checks for people for $700,000 and $800,000 and $900,000 as lump sum benefits. We converted the pension to roughly be the equivalent of what a senior transit worker would have earned when you combine their MTA pension with their union pensions and so forth. We did an actual, we worked it out actuarially. We also converted the vacation time to roughly reflect the vacation time of transit workers. So in all of these respects, we had begun to doing internal reforms inside of the union. Of course, this came with problems, internal problems, as you could well imagine. We started a whole series of measures aimed at educating the members and continuous mobilization of the members. We began shop steward and officer training. By the time the strike came around, we had recruited and graduated over 1,000 shop stewards. We took officers on training as far away as Maryland, retreats, brought in some of the brightest minds in the labor movement to teach them and to teach ourselves. And we did this extensively in 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, all the way. We began having joint executive board meetings where we got all the officers together, which was unheard of. We began having mass membership meetings of all titles, all tours, all divisions, annual. We made it annual, and in fact, we put it in the bylaws that these meetings have to be held annually, right? This just to give you an idea of the enormous amount of activities and work that we had undertaken before the strike in 2005. We began a program of community outreach, addressing and fighting fare increases, addressing and fighting boot closings, token boot closings. We began a public program to oppose one-person train operation and the elimination of conductors from trains. We began also actively seeking out allies in the community, in the immigrant communities, in the churches, among elected officials, and so forth. Even the media. We even met repeatedly with the leaders of the business community to make sure that we were not left in an isolated position. All of this was to get our house in order. But internally, we began to put the focus of the union on attacking second-class citizenship inside of the union, the underprivileged groups among transit workers. And there were many. There were traffic checkers. There were station agents. There was cleaners. There was the private bus lines, all neglected. Transit unions' culture tend to be that the operators is the privileged group. The train operators, the bus operators. And then all the way down to cleaners tend to get neglected. There was one particular group called traffic checkers. These are the folks that stand up on the street corner or on the platform and do a head count, a manual head count of how many of the passenger load. And they use it for whatever reasons to rearrange service and so forth. This was a group that grew from 400 or 500 people to 700 people. 90% of them, 95% of them were people of color, and the vast majority, 75%, were women. They gave them no pensions, no health benefits, and no guarantee of work, not even of 1 hour work a week. Under their contract language, they could be given from 0 to 25 hours per week. The contract actually said that you could show up for work and you could be given 0 hours. Right? So traffic checkers would come to the Transit Authority headquarters with pillows and blankets and camp overnight to be first at the window, in the hopes of getting a piece of work the following day. And again, all blacks and Hispanics and women. And this is it. And this, we had not known that this was going on inside the union, and it affected hundreds of people. But in fact, it was. And we attacked this second-class citizenship in the 2002 contract. We said to them there will be no contract signed unless the Transit Authority began to aggressively address these problems of traffic checkers. We wanted guaranteed hours, we wanted pensions, we wanted health benefits, and a whole series of improvement with respect to their treatment, and we would not sign a contract without that being addressed. Right. So, just to move on, I'm getting the signal. So we also continued organizing shop stewards. We organized what we call a committee of 1,000 shop stewards. We were turning out classes on a regular basis, graduating shop stewards on a regular basis. Now, all of this also was about preparation for battles with the MTA. I must have given hundreds of speeches and training sessions in which I told our people that success is where preparation meets opportunity. That opportunity will present itself. If nothing else, the employers will present opportunity because they're always attacking and always denigrating and abusing us. But you can't make use of those opportunities unless you're prepared the ground. So we did a huge amount of this shop steward recruitment that I mentioned. We took on management over harassment and abuse on the shop floor. We conducted retreats and trainings for the officers, as I pointed out. We treated every encounter, every clash with management as a dress rehearsal. One of the first things we did in the first month in office is that we fired all the arbitrators, as an example. The arbitrators have been firing our people. We had 6 of them sitting there in rooms, wherever, and just handling transit worker after transit worker discipline. 6 of them, every day, doing this. When we took office, we fired all of them. Unilaterally, which we were not supposed to do, of course. Right? The first strike we did, before this MTA strike in 2005, we had conducted 6 strikes. 2 out in Liberty Lines, which is the Westchester Transit and Express bus service. 2 out in Queens bus lines, Jamaica, Triborough Coach, Queens Bus, and so forth. And a couple out in New Canaan, Connecticut, and so on, because the Local 100 represents not just the MTA, but buses in, all the way up to Westchester, and some private bus lines, some school buses, and so on and so forth. So we had conducted six strikes. I'll give you the example of the first one. The first one we conducted was against Liberty Lines in Westchester County. When we took office, the contract expired. Again, our position, no contract, no work. We told them this, we told them take us seriously, we're not playing, things are going to happen. The contract expired, we shut down Liberty Lines. They folded in one day and gave us a 54% increase in our pensions. Sorry, a 54% increase in our health benefits, a 27% increase in our pensions, and they agreed to wage parity with MTA drivers and operators. And they did this because they had bought in to the propaganda that was around New York that Local 100 leaders were now crazy, and they raid villages and burn and pillage and plunder, and that we were going to do that in Westchester. So they folded in one day, right? And Bloomberg called me up on this, and he said, is this what you guys planning to do in New York? He said, damn well. I told him, damn well, that's what we're planning to do. Our deadline means something. So we had done 6 strikes before, again, treating every encounter as a dress rehearsal. So I'm trying to get you to the strike there now. Yeah. So on December 10th, 2005, we assembled our members in one of the mass membership meetings, which we had resumed for the first time at Jacob Javits. We packed Jacob Javits with thousands of members. And the members voted overwhelmingly to authorize a strike if the executive board decided that we had to go on strike. The courts would later said that that vote was unanimous. On December 13th and 14th, we had gone to court to do some preemptive moves against the MTA. But in December 13th and 14th, the court, New York State Court, issued preliminary injunctions and restraining orders against us, against us conducting, engaging, or participating in a strike, sick out, or slowdown, or any other concerted activity. In fact, what they did is they did some what you call forum shopping. they removed the legal case from Manhattan and assigned it to Judge Theodore Jones in Kings County, Brooklyn, which both the union and the MTA were headquartered in Manhattan. So this was deliberate shopping for an appropriate judge. Theodore Jones, as you could well imagine, was a black judge. So, this was on the 13th and 14th. On the 15th, the executive board met. This was the expiration of the strike, of the deadline, and made a decision to go on strike. So this was a very interesting meeting, and I can't go into all of the details except if it comes up in the question and answer period. But the executive board voted 27 to go on strike, about 10, I believe, against going on strike, and 5 people abstained. Before we did that, or after we did that, the union went to court to seek an injunction against the MTA over it including pension changes in its final offer. This was on the 18th of December. But on the 15th, when we had met, we had decided that because the 15th was a Thursday, we were not going to go out on strike that night. That it was better to go out on strike on a Monday rather than a Thursday because of the intervening weekend. So on the Monday, the 19th, we first took out Triborough Coach and Jamaica buses. They were not subject to the MTA, but that was like a shot across the bow to the MTA, that we were serious. They still did not pay heed, and in fact, on the 19th, what they did is they changed their pension demand to say that instead of a full 3062 pension, they were now looking to allow the retirement age to stay at 25.55, but new hires would have to pay 6% towards their pensions, which represents a tripling of the contributions from 2% to 6%. What they did not understand is that this was like putting blood in the water. And that's how the executive board saw it. Because now not only were you toying with us and not respecting our deadline, but you were insulting us and asking us to eat our unborn, eat the future generations of transit workers. And I think that at the end of the day, that is how the executive board viewed it. So very quickly, the question was called on the executive board, and it moved to a vote, despite my own personal urging of the executive board to continue having the discussions in the executive board. I was fully agreed with going on strike, but I wanted to make sure that the executive board was comfortable and more people were united around the idea of going on strike, because the greater the challenge, the more buy-in you want, right? So, we ended up on the 20th of going out on strike. The MTA immediately filed for contempt. The courts held us in contempt, charging $1 million a day. TW International issued a poster saying transit workers should report for work, meaning cross the picket lines. Do you have a copy of that there? Is it? Yeah, that was the poster all over the properties from the International Union saying, go report to work. But also interestingly, on the second day of the strike, a group of officers from MAPSTOR Division 1, which is the Manhattan buses, sent us a letter saying that they think that the MTA's last and final offer should be put to the members for a vote in the middle of the strike. This meant, we think we knew who was behind that, but this meant that this was an attempt to collapse the strike from within, but also to create a pretext to place the union under receivership for the International Union to step in. So by the 22nd, of course, the NYPD and state troopers were hunting our officers all over the tri-state area to serve court orders on us. Right? I held a press conference with over 40 labor leaders at the time. And of course, there were lots of words of support and sympathy. And I said to them, I don't need sympathy and support. I don't need anyone to hold my coat. I need people to take their coats off and get in the ring. And that was not about, no set of coats was coming off, was about to happen. Right? So in short, why we came back? We came back because we had won. On the central issue on which we struck, which was to block the pensions, we had won. More important, not more important, but also because we had a signed agreement, signed on the second day of the strike with all of the terms, wage increases, Martin Luther King Day off, the pension was pointedly removed. In fact, we won so decisively that not only was the pension demand removed, but the MTA agreed to a pension refund to our members to the tune of $131.7 million. And that was written into the agreement. That was written into the agreement signed on the 22nd of December, when we were to come back to work the following day. Now, we also agreed to an employee contribution towards medical coverage, towards retiree medical coverage of 1.5%. And that became very controversial, and the confusion around it led to the contract that was submitted to the members in January being voted down by 7 votes. I just want to take a quick minute on that. What was put out over there to confuse the members was that this 1.5% contribution was 1.5% each year, coming up to 4.5% deduction from the contract award, which of course was not the case. It was a 1.5%. And the problem is that this medical contribution was not without precedent to cover retiree medical coverage. Transit workers retire at age 55, Medicare kicks in at age 65. In that period between 55 and 65, if you're outside of the tri-state area, our medical plans and coverage had collapsed because the providers were not accepting reimbursements anymore across the country because the reimbursements were tagged at a 1980 rate. And therefore, they were not accepted. They were turning people away. The cost of providing that benefit was factored into the contract and into the 1.5%. The 1.5% was more than that, was more than that cost, but it covered that cost fully. So we came back because the risk and obstacles were considerable. We were up against the MTA. We were up against a governor who was looking to become the next president. Pataki had a search committee going on at the time. We were up against a rabid anti-media establishment embodied by Rupert Murdoch, a united business establishment, a public that had not dealt with strike, a membership that was also unfamiliar with strike, and an international president who had openly told our members to return to work. And of course, dissension within the local, including that letter I just referred to from this December 21st, and mounting tailor law fines. But we had secured a victory over the pensions, we had secured the contract, we had secured Martin Luther King Day, we had secured more than what was at the table before we went out on strike, and therefore we came back to work at the direction of the executive board on the December 23rd, I believe. So further proof of this, that this strike was victorious, was in the fact that that no one could reasonably argue that the transit strike of 2005 had the impact that, for instance, the PATCO strike had, which had adverse consequences on concessionary bargaining across the country. Generally speaking, if you talk to New Yorkers, I'm putting aside some nutty transit workers for a minute, they will tell you that strike was inspiring, was powerful, right? It had community support. We like what you guys did, and we wish our union would do the same. Again, you got to put aside, you know. So, okay. So further proof that the strike was successful, I think, lies in this next round of bargaining that was to come about. In the next round of bargaining was in 2008. We negotiated it successfully before the expiration of that contract. We negotiated in 2008, if you recall, there was the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression in the 30s. We still negotiated a successful contract with wages and a number of other economic gains in a timely manner. This is important because it would later be said that the strike tied the transit union locals' hands from fighting in the future, when in fact we negotiated a contract immediately after the 2005 strike and did it successfully. So what is false is that we came back without a signed agreement. That was false. What was also false that was said was that we did not have to strike. That all we had to be, since pensions are not a non-mandatory subject of bargaining and it can't be imposed, that all we had to do was say no. That is not the case. We had filed to that effect. On the 18th, the courts rejected our request for an injunction on the 18th of December, before we went out on strike. And of course, it's wrong to say that we gained nothing more, because we gained substantially more. It was also said that the MTA had withdrawn their Tier 6 demand, the demand for Tier 6 pension, before we went out on strike. That also was not true. The MTA's last and final offer, which would have been put before an arbitration panel, was for a 6% contribution from new hires. Now understand what that means. I was speaking to someone just last night, and he was telling me that that UFT is now saying that fixing Tier 6 is the #1 priority. Well, guess what? That is now the #1 priority in many unions, including in TW Local 100. Because it has become so divisive. This Tier 6 was passed in 2012. This is now 13 years later. It means that the majority of the workforce in TW, in UFT, and in other unions are now belong to Tier 6. And therefore, new workers are saying, you guys sold us out. And therefore, the union there's a fault line running straight down the middle of the union. People are divided over the issue, and that division is going to last for a long time. Much like what existed before, when Tier 1 pension, which is a 2050 pension, was lost in before 1973. And transit workers then turned around and said, our #1 demand is for 2050 pension. They wanted that pension restored. And that remained the most divisive issue in transit for over 30 years. This Tier 6 pension will continue to be a divisive issue until it is fixed. And it may never be fixed, because the Tier 1 pension was never fixed. Right? And that shows the consequence of what would have happened had we accepted the Tier 6 pension in the 2005 strike or not gone out on strike. And interestingly enough, the very people that opposed us going out on strike and said we didn't have to go out on strike accepted the Tier 6 pension in 2012 when Cuomo shoved it up them. Right? They accepted the Tier 6 pension. Not a shot was fired. No mass mobilizations, no strikes, no demonstrations. They accepted the TS expansion. The same people who had said that the 1.5 was a betrayal in the first negotiations they did in TW Local 100, they accepted it, they moved it to 2% contribution from 1.5 to 2%. So that's the record. So we moved on, and I have to wrap this up much quicker than I expected.
But we're going to have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah. I want to just quickly point out the penalties that came down after the strike. The penalties included $2.5 million fine by the courts. It was in April of 2006. $2.5 million in fines on the union. Members had to pay for each day they were out on strike. Union leadership was charged $1,000, I believe, meaning the top 3 leaders. I was given 10 days in jail, which turned out to be 3 days, effectively. But most importantly, our dues were removed. Dues were revoked. And that was the most serious penalty. It was intended to destroy the union, to crush, bankrupt the union. So the way it worked is that the $2.5 million fine was required to be repaid in 12 installments from June of 2006 until June of 2007. And that once that $2.5 million was fined, the court ordered then they wanted to revoke our dues. So obviously this was intended to crush the union. Their intention was to send a message across the labor movement that when you strike, only bad things will happen to you, right? We're going to give you a beatdown, make it a public flogging, and keep on beating you until the whole world sees that nothing good comes from strike. That was the message that they wanted to convey, and unfortunately, there were enough elements inside of our union and inside the transit and in the international who wanted to help them with that message, right? And so that was the that's how the penalties unfolded, and we survived it because we launched a massive Save Our Union campaign that resulted in us collecting, instead of $1.8 million a month in dues, we went down to collecting $1.2 million. But the vast majority of transit workers stepped up and paid their dues, or paid part of their dues. Large numbers paid all of their dues. Some paid a year in advance of dues to help out. And we would not have survived were it not for our members standing with the union. And we would not have been able to survive were it not for the work that we had put on for the 4 or 5 years prior to the strike of mobilizing our members, educating our members over the issue of defending both their union, defending the unborn, standing up in solidarity, rather than every man for himself, and so forth. I think that those are some of the lessons. I'll have to stop at this point, but I have a number of other points to make that I'll be more than happy to do so in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Roger. I felt like the villain, but I think we need to leave a little time for the panel discussion, and we'll have plenty of time to pursue some of these questions in greater depth. But I think I want to start our discussion by handing things over to my colleague, Professor Otto, for his thoughts and reactions. It's a tough act to follow. I apologize in advance, but and any questions that you may have as well.
Is that great? Perfect. Well, it's wonderful to be here, and I learned a lot in that presentation. I should say that I'm a generation or two removed from my fellow panelists, and I was probably would be qualified as one of the unborn, although I didn't enter transit. In 2005, I was 22 years old, so just a year after being able to buy a beer. And I had no real interest in questions of transportation I was still figuring out what I wanted to do. Within 3 or 4 years, I had figured out what I wanted to research and do, and it was transportation, although it was not transportation labor. It was my focus was on the condition of transit riders and transit-dependent people. It quickly dawned on me that the rights of the transit-dependent and the rights of transit operators and workers, we ought to think about them together. And so a lot of my research has been on that. So I was, some of the questions I had were about the ability to not only mobilize members, but to mobilize the public. As I said in 2005, I was, my prefrontal cortex had barely was still in development. But I do remember the one thing I did hear about the strike, which was that the workers were greedy thugs, and that's not something you mentioned. And part of why I bring that up is that some of the public support for the strike came both from the work you had done, but also the kind of reaction that came from Bloomberg and Pataki and the press. So I was kind of thinking about how you think about building public support, what the experience of the 2005 strike, what lessons we might learn in terms of building community labor, solidarity.
Yeah, historically, the TW had fought against, for instance, fare increases for decades. To keep the fare, historically, it was 5 cents fare in the 30s and 40s. And that changed sometime in the 1950s when they created the Board of Transportation, moved from the Board of Transportation to New York City Transit Authority. And they made that move in order to remove the subway fare from city politics, from the city election. So they made it because the Transit Authority was now state-run. And the important point to make there that's responsive to your question is that in its first 20 years or so of operation, the TW distinguished itself, like most of the CIO unions, by the alliances with the communities, the working class communities in New York, and they defended the 5 cents fare in that context, and that began to change in the 1950s. Last night I was at a meeting in Bedford-Stuyvesant where I spoke on this issue, among folks who are attempting to block the next fare increase scheduled for January, and some of them were complaining that when they attempted to speak to transit workers, they felt intimidated and fearful of supporting because they had come to believe that fare increases result in wage increases for them, which is a failure of the union of educating, but it's also a failure of human nature. I mean, people, that's the human condition. But I am more interested in what we could affect, which is the union's mindset has changed from under my leadership. We actively fought every time against fare increases, against cuts in service, against the closing of the booths, and made that a principle, an organic part of how we operated. And that meant that this is the message that our officers were hearing, the message our members were hearing, and so on. That is no longer the case, has not been the case for some time in the transit union. And as a result, you have more transit workers who buy into this thing that the fare increases is a good thing for them, and and all of the enforcement measures you've seen around the city, where they have these teams boarding buses and challenging people whether you pay your fare, and dragging you off the bus if need be, and arresting you, and all of this type of madness. So it is. I believe that the role that Labour, when Labour was at its best, at its strongest, its most effectiveness, was when it based itself on an alliance with the communities.
Let me just add something to pick up on something else that Kafui said about this business of Mayor Bloomberg saying that the transit leaders were thuggish. And I think in the context of the time, that let, and I'm curious, Roger, if you agree with me, it let the race cat out of the bag. That the leadership and much of the membership of the union was African American and, thuggish. And actually, I think this was the beginning of the end for the mayor and the governor because first Al Sharpton and then Roger said, I think Sharpton said something like, we went on strike against a pension increase. Why does that make us thugs, And I think my favorite anecdote about this is somehow in the middle of this, for some reason or other, Mayor Bloomberg decides to go to some meeting for small business at Junior's in downtown Brooklyn. And as he was walking into the restaurant, a woman stood up and shouted, "Transit workers are not thugs." And, New Yorkers don't think transit workers are thugs, And I think so, I think you're right that the public view of this, some of the balance tipped because of the really vile attitudes that some of the establishment had towards transit workers, and who they were. So, do you have another question, or should I?
No,
I have a question for you, Roger, and then we'll get to some audience questions. I began by saying how transit workers were exceptional, and I'm curious why you think that is. I mean, why is it that over 60 years of New York public sector unionism, the transit workers have been the one group with big gaps, but the one group that has over and over stood up to defend their rights?
Well, I mean, I came into transit in the early 80s. And I came out of, I am not a good example because I came out of fighting in Trinidad, being arrested in Trinidad, expelled from school, fighting at Brooklyn College, fighting in Crown Heights and Bed-Stuy over police murders and so on, before I came into transit. So I was built for this type of stuff. But when I came into transit, from the very beginning, it was very evident and clear that the mindset among transit workers was, yes, we know that we cannot strike and we know about the Taylor law, but heaven forbid they provoke us, we will strike. And I don't know that you could say that about any other public sector workers, but there was never, I never saw any considerable wavering from that position among transit workers. A mindset that, yeah, we will go out on strike. And in fact, as time grew on in the 80s and 90s, transit workers were itching for a fight. I think that if we had gone back in 2005 and told them, when we went to the executive board, after the International pleaded with us to not go out, the executive board was eager for the international officers to leave the meeting and call the question and order a strike. Such was the mindset among transit workers. And that, that reflected what was going on among our members. People had taken so much abuse that they wanted a chance to put a foot up their asses. And that is just what it was. Now, I don't know if that might be a function of an enduring legacy. Right? Because we were very mindful that we had inherited a legacy that said when the contract expires at midnight on All Year's Night, that something was going to happen. We knew that this was the legacy we were carrying, right? And so you always have to answer the question: are you going to fulfill? Are you going to stand up for that legacy? Are you going to betray it? is that legacy going to be betrayed on your watch? And I think that at a certain level among the officer corps in TW Local 100, the mindset was not on our watch. Now, I can't say that's the case today, because the next time, as soon as the leadership was changed, they went without a contract from 2012 until 2014, for 2 years without a contract. And that which was not the case under us. Under my administration, we settled contracts in a timely manner, even though 2 of those contracts ended up in arbitration because they reneged on the agreements that they had signed. And so in a backhanded way, it ended up in arbitration.
I'm going to ask some questions that have come from the audience, some of which came ahead of tonight. They were sent in, and a few cases I'm going to reword them, but I hope I'm keeping the essence of them. One question came up about the end of the strike, and the question was why the executive board, when it voted, hadn't seen, or maybe didn't even know about the written agreement. And it struck me, that speaks to a broader issue about the balance in a situation like that between democratic procedure and the needs of the moment. And I was wondering if you could address that.
Right. So when the executive board ended the strike on the, what must have been the night of the 22nd, I can't recall if it was night or the morning or whatever. The executive board had listened to the international, they received a report from me that said that we have everything that we need to return to work. The executive board understood that I had spoken clearly that we were not going to accept a new pension, and we were not going to accept any concessions. The executive board, based on my recommendation, voted to go back to work. Now, at that time, we had a signed agreement in place. The problem was that the public posture of the governor, the mayor, and the newspapers is that there was going to be no negotiations as long as we were out, right? And as long as we had an agreement, we didn't care what they said publicly, right? That agreement was then converted into a full memorandum of understanding on the 27th of December, and the executive board again voted on that agreement, recommended it for membership ratification. So that was the course of events. In the situation where we were in a very public space and facing the danger of, which is in fact what happened, and I think you were mentioning that in our conversations before this. Governor Pataki went off, and as did Mayor Bloomberg when they found that an agreement had been made, right? And that the pension was withdrawn, and a pension refund was agreed to, in fact, right? And so forth. And what they did is that they began to demand that the agreement be abandoned. And when the contract was voted on by 7 votes, they seized the opportunity to withdraw support for the agreement that they had signed, that they had agreed to, right? That meant that just demonstrates how the kind of contentious situation that we were in the middle of. So that's the best I can say.
We are getting.
Roger, really?
No, Mark, come on. You can't do that. You can't, Mark.
No, wait. You want to take over the meeting? You want to take over the meeting? You want to take over the meeting?
Come on. No, come on. Let's go. We're getting we're getting a million questions here, and we can't. We're not even going to get to all of them. So here's a question. It's interesting. We got the same question from a SLU student who's in the UFT, but also from 2 transit workers with us tonight. And basically they're saying, looking back, is there anything you would have done differently? If you had to lead a transit strike today, what would you do differently than in 2005?
Well, I don't think that my mindset is into strike avoidance. I don't think that there was any way to avoid the strike. I think that you could always talk about how you could have been prepared better and more thoroughly. And I imagine that there are definite ways in which that could have been done, including mitigating some of the internal problems that we had among our officers. Some mitigation could have been done there, but I think that in that respect, that die was cast as well. There were some people who wanted to steer the ship to the rocks. It's almost like I'm mindful of the story about Fidel and the Pope when they went out fishing and the wind blew the Pope's skull cap off his head into the water. And Fidel gets up and walks across the water and picks it up and brings it back and puts it on the Pope's head. And the next morning, the Miami Herald's headline was, "Fidel can't swim."
So this is maybe going back a couple questions that you mentioned that one of the things that you've observed and that's a negative is that transit workers often see fare increases as potential wage increases, but in the reverse, this gets to kind of a more contemporary issue with the proposal for fare-free transit. Fare-free transit, sorry. Has the TWU or you, what is your position on that proposal?
I can't speak for TWU now,
right,
and
okay.
I don't know what TWU's position is on this issue now. I know I am in favor of free transit. I think there is a democratic issue of people's mobility, right? Because I think that in the absence of having the ability to move around, that you are limited in terms of your access to housing, education, culture, jobs, and so forth. And in fact, everywhere that has been experimented with, it has been successful, and including leading to a reduction in assaults on transit workers, confrontations with riders, and so forth. The Staten Island is traveling to New York on the ferry for free. And when they come off the ferry, and that's been the case since 1999, and when they come off the ferry, they get on a bus service, which Local 100 also represents, called New York Waterway at 42nd Street. And they get a free bus service down to the Wall Street area. The justification that they give for this is that, unlike other boroughs, Staten Islanders don't have access into the city. And therefore they have free ferry service and free bus service into downtown, into the Wall Street area. But I think that free bus service would be successful, and it'd have all-round benefits. I mean, at the end of the day, when you pay your fare, you're paying your fare for the most purposes is to go to work. So you're going to an employer to perform work, and you have to go back home. Effectively, you're providing a service to the employer that you are paying for from the paycheck that you obtain from the employer. So you can't get any more direct of a taxation than that. So it's reasonable to say that the fare should therefore be funded from businesses and employers, or at least broadly, and that would be far more fair. Other than going to work, you have students, and who would argue that students should be taxed in terms of paying for the subway and bus fares? So I think that the argument, if you put aside all of this hard story about city funding and state funding and so forth, and you put that aside, it is reasonable to argue that mass transportation should be treated as a right for New Yorkers.
Two different transit workers or retired transit workers ask variations of the same question. I'm just going to read the beginning of one. It says, yes, the strike was a monumental event, and I am proud to have been part of it, but the union was weaker after the strike than before. This has to be accounted for. And, it is, to me, I think you somewhat addressed this, but, not just in terms of TWU, but in terms of the whole public sector, rather than leading to greater militancy, we kind of returned to the pre-2005 situation pretty quickly. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, insofar as you're talking about the other unions, one of the reasons why the victory of blocking the pension, the Tier 6 pension, did not resonate in the labor movement is because many of the other unions didn't want to be held up to the same standard to fight to block a new pension. And they all laid down before Andrew Cuomo in 2012. And a new pension, a Tier 6 pension was imposed. So you can see why they don't want to have a lot of conversations about the success of blocking the new pension in 2005. The first part of your question?
I guess I was, picking up from the question submitted, I'm going to even broaden it out. I mean, how do we explain how quiescent labor's been? Just stepping back, it was a complicated story, 2005. It's not as simple, everything went well or everything went bad. But since then, it seems as if the ambitions have diminished so much. Right. How do we explain that?
As far as Local 100 was concerned, as I pointed out, we negotiated a subsequent contract, 2008, 2009 to 2012, and that was a successful negotiation. And and to me that was in the middle of the 2008 economic crisis, and that demonstrates, to my mind, strength. Now, what happened is that after changes in the leadership of the local, the number one lesson, there was education programs being conducted at Local 100 in which the number one lesson that shop stewards were being taught was that the 2005 transit strike was a bad thing. That was the number one lesson that was taught from 2010 on among transit workers by some people who are in this room today.
Okay, so this is a question that was submitted earlier from Martin with the UFT. How do you assess the possibility in this present era for significant changes or a full repeal of the strike prohibition provisions of the Taylor Law in the New York State Legislature?
In 2009, the International Labour Organization issued a decision, which is part of the United Nations, and declared that the strike was legal, and that the penalties were illegal. And they wrote to the government and said that this needs to be addressed. Of course, it has never been. But the ILO said that this was a violation of two ILO covenants involving freedom of association and freedom to engage in collective action. So that has been left as a dead letter. To the extent that you're talking about changing the Taylor Law or reforming it, because there are no penalties, there are burdens on the workers, burdens on the unions, prohibitions against strike and all collective actions, sick-outs, slowdowns, anything, and with severe penalties, and no burdens or pressures or penalties on the employer to either bargain in good faith, to negotiate contracts in a timely manner, to honor deadlines, none of that. So you could talk about fighting for reforms, but that successes in that area would only be a measure of the strength of the unions organizing and mobilizing, something that you don't see much of in the labor movement today. Having been active for so long and at a high level in the labor movement, both in TW and in the national labor movement, I do not have much hopes for the leaders of organized labor. Right? I have said for some time, at least since the Wisconsin uprising, that the leadership of organized labor is incapable, right, of birthing the type of militant leadership needed to move things forward in terms of labor and social justice causes. And that leadership will have to come, in terms of birthing a new leadership, will have to come from elsewhere and not from organized labor, the leadership of organized labor. That's my own personal sense of things.
Let me ask you a question, which maybe in a way you've just answered, but these are sort of partly my question and a question we have from someone who's a member of Teamsters Local 1205 here, who says, you know, you talked about how the TWU International worked against the strike, and he asks, how can we militants combat and win back leadership in our unions from leadership that represents the interests of ruling class in the state instead of the interests of workers? And I would also ask, maybe as part of that, you could maybe address something you mentioned briefly. You know, why did other unions in New York not take off their jackets? You know, I mean, it was pretty notable how little support, it seemed to me, that you got in 2005.
We got support, it's just that we could have gotten a lot more. In the negotiations, a number of union leaders showed up to stand with us in front of the cameras, including UFT 1199, Retail Workers Union, and a number of others that I can't recall, but there were a number of unions there. And in repaying the penalties, we were paying $208,000 every month for 12 months. We received a number of sizable checks from a number of unions, including one of the first checks we got was from OPIU, the Office of Professional Employees International Union. They sent us a check right away for $50,000 to help us pay for the fines, for the monthly fines. And we received checks from a number of others. I think I will forget the list of others who sent us checks for tens of thousands of dollars to help out, but we did receive quite a bit. And it turns out the international union went into crisis, and the guy who was the international president, after he came out against the strike, he went out sick and never returned to work, right? So he was another casualty of the strike. That was Mike O'Brien, right? Under the new international president at the time, they also rendered assistance and gave us substantial monies to help paying the fines, meaning in the tens of thousands of dollars. I can't remember the number again. So we got help in that respect. But in the critical moments of the strike, more could have been done, right? People could have been more forceful. I mean, I am not saying necessarily that the only recourse was to move from a transit strike to a general strike. It's one of the reasons why you have to treat strikes as a last resort. Because after you go out on strike, you have shut your load, you don't have any other way of applying pressure unless the option of moving to a general strike is in the cards or staging an insurrection. No, I'm serious. Sometimes those things are in the cards. And unless you can move to a general strike, you have no other way of applying pressure, right? I mean, you could harness community support, you could do mass demonstrations and protests, and we were doing all of that long before the strike, right? But I think that more could have been done short of calling a general strike, to be more forceful, because we were the only ones at the mic. Others could have gone to the mic and because oftentimes more powerful than a strike is the credible threat of one. So you could have made a credible threat that this was going to go south and we were going to join TWU if this wasn't fixed in a more reasonable manner. But such a credible threat was not made. But I would think that if the shoe was on the other foot, we would have found other ways to send a message to Bloomberg and Pataki that they would have to take on more than that single bargaining unit. We would have found ways to convey that message. That did not happen in this case, and as a result, I mean, part of it is that if we go on strike and everybody else in the labor movement applauds and supports it and so forth, the members turn to them and say, "So when are we going out?" And a lot of them, Don't want to hear that, you know. So there's an avoidance of the consequences of strong support for strike action. But we knew that we may have been in this alone. But at the same time, in the middle of things when the NYPD and the state troopers were hunting our officers across 3 states, right? And they were talking fines, and they were talking, and the international was squeezing us, and this, that, and the other was going on. In the heat of that battle, we could have used more support.
Let me ask you a follow-up on part of that question from the person from the Teamsters who's talking about, you know, what do you do if you're a rank and filer, a militant in a union whose leaders aren't serving workers well? And let me ask you to put on your pre-2000 hat, your pre-1997 hat. And you spent a lot of years organizing workers in exactly that situation. Give us a 2-minute summary of how you and your colleagues did it.
Well, New Directions had been persistent from in terms of criticizing and attacking the MTA since 1985 for 15 years, as you mentioned. I think the difference that emerged towards the time when we took over the union, it was a more militant leadership emerged within New Directions, led by myself and others, similarly situated in other departments, which is the reason why they fired me 2.5 years before the change occurred, because our approach to dealing with the arrogance and the abuse of the MTA, as opposed to before us, the opposition and New Directions were expert pamphleteers and leaflet writers, right? Can criticize the hell out of things and analyze the hell out of things. The difference is that when we stepped up, we took the fight to the MTA, right? The crews that I came up in, we would go for the most egregious, abusive superintendent and come to them and tell them, we come in for you. And they had been unaccustomed to the fight being brought to them. And I think that is how you change things. Change does not occur until you meet or exceed the intensity of the attacks that you are faced with. I think it's simple physics, right? If you're going to change something, you got to bring a force better than the next guy. You got to convey a credible threat. And you got to be able to deliver on it, not just talk and, and so on, threaten. And I think that more and more, one of the things that New Directions was characterized by is a lot of people who brought up on charges, suspended, and threatened with firing or being fired, and myself included. Because more and more people were tired of the pamphleteering and wanted to see militant direct action as well. Not no pamphlets and of course those things are good, right? But you need, when you're dealing with that type of intense attacks, then you need to be able to step to it.
Let's, if we can, squeeze in 2 more. We have so many great written questions, and then we'll try to squeeze in 2 or 3 live questions on the mic. Do you have 1 or 2 more, Kafui and Josh, you want to ask from the written questions? And raise your hands, please, in the room if you'd like to ask questions on the mic.
Actually, there seems to be a lot of questions in the room. Let's move to the.
Okay.
Testing?
Actually, we'll control.
Okay,
yeah.
great.
We'll start back here, and then we'll go to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Mr. Toussaint, and thank you for this conversation. Lumumba Bandele with the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. You talked about exceeding the opposition's force. Can you talk about sacrifice? Because folks, I think, have an idea of what it takes, but when they actually have to face consequences of that, how do you gather your comrades, other people, to understand the kind of sacrifice that it takes to be able to meet that kind of think that you need to do?
I think it takes time, and it takes actual handling the penalties. I mean, lots of people again were suspended and fired before we got to the point in 2000 where we were able to take over the union. So if you're not prepared to take the bumps and the bruises and the bloodshed, then you're in the wrong business. You know, and you know, that is as simple as that. And I think that until you have a leadership that's willing to square with that and say, bring it on. You know, you're not going to, you know, Malcolm X spoke about this ad nauseum. You know, that the only way you make progress is, you know, and I have made the point that you cannot, with respect to the Taylor law, for instance, you cannot attack us and then insist that you have the right to dictate to us how we fight back. Because you're going to always dictate that you want one of our hands tied behind our backs and one of our feet on only one foot left. Right? That's obviously you making the rules. So you have to be prepared to break the rules. We were prepared to go against the Taylor law, even though we knew that it came with penalties and consequences. And unless and until you are prepared to do that, then you will remain being a slave. Slavery was illegal and came with penalties, including execution and so forth. You know, driving in the back of the bus was legal. All of these things. And they were only broken with struggle and sacrifice.
Hi, good evening, Mr. Toussaint. Thank you for being here. My question is, what advice would you give to unions now in reference to mobilizing, considering you faced a lot of opposition with mobilizing and getting your workers to strike when they know that they needed a fair contract? And of course, you know, right now we're facing this, I guess, bill is what I'm gonna say to be nice right now. But you know, in the medical field, we're taking a big hit with this, and it's only the beginning. So of course, we're going to have to mobilize as a union to fight a lot of what's being taken from not only us, but our patients and our workers. What advice can you give to the ones that are kind of like, oh, we don't need to mobilize, everything is okay right now, we'll be fine? What advice would you give to kind of get these workers to understand and grasp what's at stake?
My focus would be on the conscious element, the more progressive, the more militant element among the workers, not on obviously on people who are of that type of mindset. I think it will take a long time for them to come along, but I think that in transit, it began with like-minded people getting together in each division and then finding each other. So whether it begins with 2 or 3 people, I tell people that we took over leadership of the track division with basically 2 or 3 people. It started with 2 or 3 people. And we took over the leadership of the entire almost 2,000 member track division. But I think that was replicated through most of the other divisions. It always starts with 2 or 3 people. So don't be disheartened if you only have 2 or 3 people to start with. That's always how change starts. And you don't necessarily need a majority to force change. In the history of the labor movement, in the Flint, Michigan sit-down strikes, only 10% of the workforce participated in those sit-down strikes, but they led the 90%, right? And that is the case, generally speaking, in struggles and fights. So don't be disheartened. Start with 2 or 3 people. Meet, organize, because organizing multiplies your strength, multiplies your reach. Put out leaflets, put out information. Do not restrict yourself to social media posting, right? Organizing is hand-to-hand combat. Organizing is a contact sport, right? If you want to post on social media, you would never know from someone posting on social media that you're talking to a psychopath. Right? Because people write better than they can act and be. So you can write very nicely on social media, and you could be a straight out sociopath or psychopath. And there are many out there. Right? So organizing is boots on the ground, hand-to-hand combat, contact sport. Right? That's the traditional way. That's how you know people. You got to put eyes on them. You got to go into battle with them, see how they react, see how they don't react, see what they're for, see where they just show up. You know what I'm saying? Because it's social media, you don't have to show up. You just have to go to your laptop or your desktop or your phone, actually. You know?
Okay, we're going to do a question here. Then there's a question in the back, and we'll take as many as possible. We'll keep going. Please keep your questions, comments to about a minute or less, please.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Eric King. I am a current New York City transit worker coming up on 28 years in the Transit Authority. I'm a conductor. I was working with transit since 1998. I took part in the strike, walked the strike line in 2005. I have part statement and part question. To you, sir, you mentioned about the union getting a little bit weaker after the 2005 strike after Roger Toussaint left office. Well, one of the contracts under John Samuelson, we all witnessed over the media bribe of the union that when the Transit Authority told the union, we will pay you $6 million if you get your members to accept the 8% contract that had a lot of givebacks in the contract. This was the first time where you heard an over-the-air bribe and no one made big news about it. The union completely sold us out under John Samuelson when the other Long Island Railroad and Metro North were staging threats to go on strike. We accepted an 8% contract with no Me Too clause in the contract to match the gains of Long Island Railroad and Metro North. And this was the first time we accepted a bribe. I was proud to stand behind this man, Roger Toussaint, who never took money under the table, sold us out, and we had nothing but gains in each of the 3 contracts that this man did. I would like to ask you, Roger Toussaint, how did you feel and what you would have did differently when they offered the $6 million, $2 million in each of the years going forward for you to use however you wish, which the union never explained what they did with the $6 million after they sold us out with an 8% contract with nothing but givebacks, and they reversed everything that Roger Toussaint gave us.
I've been retired now since 2012, 13 years. And I've been living out of New York. I haven't followed things that closely. I know about the 8% situation. I know about the 8% situation. I don't know about the $6 million bribe, as you call it. But what you're referring to is that in 2014, the way that contract eventually, it was 2 years late, the way that contract was resolved for transit was that the MTA and the governor had refused to negotiate a contract for 2 years until the Long Island Railroad was getting ready to go before federal mediation with a demand for a 17% raise. At that point, Governor Cuomo contacted Local 100 and brought in Local 100, and Local 100 agreed to 8% raise over 5 years, and that became the governor's case before the Federal Mediation Board of the pattern that they should follow instead of the 17% that Long Island Railroad was demanding. As it turned out, the federal government the Federal Mediation Board ended up awarding Long Island Railroad 17%. But they used Local 100 to come up with a 8% alternative. That I know about, right? That I researched, and that is the facts of what occurred in 2014 to resolve the contract that turned out to be a 5-year contract from 2012 to 2017. The other part of your question, Just let me, before people leave here, because I know we're running out of time, are we? There is one thing that I want to address before we leave here, which is the confusion that's put out there that said that we agreed to come back to work by promising that we would never go out on strike. Let me address that for a second. In the court order that imposed an injunction and restraining order on us, the judge, and I'm reading from the order here, the judge said that Civil Service Law 220 paragraph 3 did not violate the right to free speech under the United States Constitution. Said section of Civil Service Law provides that an employee organization must submit an affirmation stating that it does not assert the right to strike or to assist or participate in a strike before becoming certified to act as an exclusive representative for bargaining. So if you absorb that, what that means is that there's a requirement and a burden on all unions who are certified to recognize, to affirm that they do not assert, that they do not have the right to strike, and they do not assert such a right, which is the statement that we made in order to get dues restored. That doesn't mean that you don't go out and strike. That's what, we didn't have the right to strike in 1980 and we went out and strike. We didn't have the right to strike in 2005 and we went out and strike. But it is a requirement of certification that you have to affirm this as a matter of law. So I wanted to just clarify that, because you have some sanctimonious folks running around who are more militant than everyone else, who will tell you that that what we agreed to was to never go on strike. Okay?
Okay, so we're just going to go 5 more minutes. We're going to try to squeeze in 3 or 4 questions. Let's ask the questions all at once. Panel, if you can write down some notes to remember these 3 or 4 questions. So let's do 2 in the back. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Eric Josephson. I am a retired transit worker. I was a track worker. I was a shop steward for something like almost 30 years, and I was vice chair in the track division, elected twice. I am glad that Brother Toussaint is talking about the possibility, the discussion of general strikes, keeping the option open, at least theoretically. I'm glad that he's bringing that up now. It would have been good if he had brought up the suggestion, the thought that this might be necessary at some point, not to call a general strike, but to put it into the discussion. I also remember that there were some brother and sister workers from Metro North who sought us out in the build-up to the strike and who mentioned to us that they have the right to strike, and in fact, if they see a picket line anywhere, they cannot cross it. Their contracts forbid it, and they asked that to keep it in mind. We did. A number of us brought it up to Brother Toussaint, and he said, no chance, it's not going to happen. I think that was a wrong move, and that had we managed to bring it up, make it possible, make the threat possible, that we would have had a chance to strike not only in New York City, but to have follow-up and support from all over the Eastern Seaboard. Of course, we'll never know now. Thank you.
Okay, that's okay. That's
Will
a
we
comment.
ever
Next,
know?
let's go right here.
Yeah, so I'm Tom from
Please keep it. We want to squeeze in as many comments and questions.
Transit Workers for a Fighting Union. Still a racist plantation justice still going on today. We're fighting now to reinstate a coworker who was grotesquely, unjustly fired by the MTA's racist overlords. But I did want to say that the Taylor law is fulsomely supported by the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. We raised up in the important point about how we went on strike to stop Tier 6. A few years later, Cuomo, Democrat, rammed it through in the middle of the night without any opposition. And I think that answers the question that was also raised about why did this labor movement not mobilizing its forces in independent, sharp action? That's because they're totally beholden to the Democrats through this period. Even Patterson, in the wake of the 2005 strike, imposed a tier five pension on most workers. They didn't dare do it on us because we had gone on strike. I was very proud to have gone on strike. I was there on the picket lines, and I also remember the incredible anger and despair when we were in East New York and told to take down picket lines without knowing anything about the details of the proposed settlement. And it is absolutely true that the legacy of the strike was deep despair, resignation, thousands stopped paying their dues, and we're still living with that legacy today. That's why we need a new leadership, absolutely militant leadership, I agree, that needs to step forward, but one that's willing to fight the MTA on this question of plantation justice and not have any belief or reliance on Democratic Party politicians. And that's why I just wanted to say that Zohran Mamdani should make a statement in opposition to the Taylor Law, that he will fight it, that he will help us tear it down. It will only really be torn down by the way the Condon-Waldron Act was torn down, with United Strike Action, real class struggle.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to go here. There's one there, and then we'll do one over here.
Hi, I'm Kat. Thank you so much for all the remarks tonight. It's been really exciting to learn more about this history. I'm also in Maoist Communist Union and Teamsters Mobilize, and bringing revolutionary greetings of solidarity from all my comrades in the Teamsters. I was wondering, since you mentioned the need for a general strike and insurrection at some point, how do you think that we need to concretely organize within our unions to get to that point? And specifically on this question of education, what type of education do we need? And how do we as militants in the unions carry that out?
Okay. Sir?
I'll keep this quick. My name is Zach. This is a little more of a policy one question off of Professor Atto's comments about the free buses. And I recall you were a supporter of congestion pricing under Mayor Bloomberg, and I'm a supporter myself, just for the record. And 20 years later here now, we have congestion pricing in different form, and just what your thoughts are on congestion pricing and community support and policy issues of that nature.
Michael, I think we should respond to these because it's a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to try to summarize because some were kind of statements as well as questions. I think this question is, if we need to go big, a general strike or whatever it might be, what's the steps now, education, whatever it might be. You were talking about the years of preparation prior to 2005. What are the years of preparation prior to something like that?
I think that your interpretation, Josh, sanitizes what she said. She said that I said that we should be preparing for general strike and insurrection and so forth. What I said is, unless a general strike and insurrection are in the cards, then you have to be very careful about going out on strike. It should be treated as a last resort, because then you have no other way of applying pressure, right? That's what I said. So I'm not into strike avoidance, but I think that when you look at general strikes that were conducted in other countries or in this country in the past, at least local general strikes, or in other countries, there are a whole lot of other factors in organizing that led to the possibility of being able to stage a general strike, none of which are available to us right now. So I think it's kind of wishful thinking. I think you have to fight. You have to take every fight and try to take it as far as you could. And that's what more active people and more militant people need to put their efforts towards. If there is, because a lot of people who talk about strikes and want to do all sorts of stuff, they never like the strike that they're in. They like the strike that they're not in, the strike that is not before them. You follow? and they tend to undermine the strike that they're in.